I woke up that Tuesday morning in Phoenix, Arizona, to discover that someone had parked a massive RV in my driveway overnight, blocking my car in completely. Not beside it, not near it, but literally boxing in my Honda Accord so tightly that I couldn't even open the driver's side door more than 6 inches. My name is Vincent Yates, and I had been living in this Sunridge Springs community for 3 years without any major issues, but this was about to change everything. I stood there in my work clothes, briefcase in hand, staring at this behemoth of a vehicle that had to be at least 35 feet long. It was one of those expensive models too, probably worth more than my annual salary as an insurance adjuster. The Arizona sun was already beating down even though it was only 7 in the morning, and I could feel sweat starting to form on my forehead as my frustration mounted. I had an important meeting at 8:30 downtown, and there was no way I was getting my car out of there. I walked around the RV, looking for any sign of who owned it or why it was there. There was no note, no license plate that I recognized, nothing. I pulled out my phone and called my supervisor to let him know I might be late. Then I started knocking on the RV door. No answer. I knocked harder. Still nothing. Whoever owned this thing clearly wasn't inside. That's when I noticed my garage door was open. Not just unlocked, but wide open, rolled all the way up. I felt my stomach drop. I had definitely closed it before going to bed the night before. I always did. Living in Phoenix, you learned quickly that leaving your garage open was an invitation for scorpions, snakes, and thieves. I walked up my driveway and peered into my garage, and what I saw made my blood pressure spike instantly. My garage, my private property that I paid for with my mortgage every month, was full of someone else's stuff. There were boxes stacked against the walls, furniture covered in moving blankets, a motorcycle on a stand, and various other items that definitely did not belong to me. Someone had turned my garage into their personal storage unit. I pulled out my phone and dialed my neighbor, Marcus, who lived 2 houses down. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding groggy. "Marcus, it's Vincent. Did you see anyone at my house last night? Someone's parked an RV in my driveway and filled my garage with their stuff." "What? No, man, I went to bed early. That's crazy. Did you call the cops?" "Not yet. I'm trying to figure out what's going on first." I hung up and walked back toward the street, looking around the neighborhood. Everything seemed normal. People were leaving for work. A few joggers were making their morning rounds, and the landscaping crew was already working on the common areas. Then I saw her. Deborah Whitmore, the HOA president, walking up my driveway with her clipboard and that expression she always wore. The one that said she knew something you didn't and was enjoying the power it gave her. Deborah was 52 years old, with perfectly highlighted blonde hair that she kept in a bob cut, and she wore khaki capris with a polo shirt that had the Sunridge Springs HOA logo embroidered on it. She took her position very seriously, perhaps too seriously. I'd had a few run-ins with her before over minor things like my mailbox being the wrong shade of beige and my front yard rock garden being 2 inches too tall according to some obscure covenant. "Good morning, Vincent," she said in that syrupy sweet voice that made my teeth hurt. "I see you've met our newest arrangement. Deborah, what the hell is going on? Why is there an RV blocking my driveway and someone's stuff in my garage?" She consulted her clipboard, running her finger down a page. According to HOA Bylaw Section 12, Paragraph 8, in cases where a homeowner has excess garage space and another resident requires temporary storage, the HOA board has the authority to designate underutilized spaces for community use. I stared at her, certain I had heard wrong. "Excuse me. That's not a real thing. You can't just put someone else's stuff in my garage. Actually, we can. It's right here in the covenants you signed when you purchased your home. You have a 2-car garage but only 1 vehicle, which means you're not using the space efficiently. The Hendersons on Sagaro Drive need temporary storage while they're renovating their home, and the board voted to allow them to use your garage for up to 90 days. My hands were shaking now, and not from the caffeine. You voted to let strangers use my garage without even asking me. Without my permission. That's breaking and entering, Deborah. That's illegal. She pursed her lips, her expression shifting from fake sweetness to barely concealed annoyance. We sent you an email notification last week. You had 48 hours to object. You didn't respond, so we took your silence as consent. I never got any email, and even if I had, you can't just take someone's property. That's not how this works. The HOA has certain rights, Vincent. If you have a problem with it, you can bring it up at the next board meeting. That's 2 weeks from Thursday at 7 p.m. in the community center. She turned to walk away, clearly considering the conversation over. Deborah, I need this RV moved right now. I have to get to work. She glanced back over her shoulder. The Hendersons will be by this evening to move it to their driveway. Until then, I suggest you find alternative transportation. Have a nice day. I watched her walk away, my mind reeling. This couldn't be legal. There was no way this was legal. I pulled out my phone and called the non-emergency police line. While I waited for someone to pick up, I took photos of everything. The RV blocking my driveway, my open garage full of someone else's belongings, and Deborah walking away down the street. The dispatcher was polite but not particularly helpful. She said she'd send an officer out to take a report, but it might be a few hours since this wasn't an emergency. I explained that I was effectively being held prisoner in my own home, unable to leave for work, but she maintained that since no one was in immediate danger, it wasn't a priority. I called my supervisor again and explained the situation more fully. He was understanding, but pointed out that I had 3 client meetings scheduled that day that couldn't easily be rescheduled. I told him I'd try to get there as soon as possible and ended the call feeling sick to my stomach. Then I did what I probably should have done first. I called a towing company. The first 2 I tried said they couldn't tow an RV from private property without the owner's permission or a police order. The third company, Cactus Valley Towing, said they could do it, but it would cost me $450 and I'd have to sign paperwork assuming liability if the owner tried to sue. Do it, I said. How soon can you get here? We can have a truck there in 45 minutes. I gave them my address and waited, pacing up and down my driveway. I called my insurance company's legal department and spoke to one of our attorneys, explaining the situation. She was shocked and agreed that the HOA had overstepped significantly. Vincent, this is trespassing and possibly theft of services. Your garage is part of your property, not a common area. The HOA has no legal right to allow third parties to use it without your explicit consent, regardless of what their bylaws say. Those kinds of provisions would never hold up in court because they violate property rights. So what do I do? Document everything. Take photos and videos. Get a police report filed. Have the RV towed if you need to. Then you'll want to send a cease and desist letter to the HOA and probably the people who put their stuff in your garage. I can refer you to a real estate attorney who handles these kinds of disputes. She gave me a name and number, and I wrote it down. By the time the tow truck arrived, I had taken probably 100 photos and several videos, including one where I walked through my garage narrating all the items that weren't mine. The tow truck driver, a guy in his 30s named Pete, surveyed the RV and whistled. That's a nice rig. You sure you want it towed? It's not mine. I didn't give anyone permission to park it here, and it's blocking me from getting to work. Yes, I want it towed. Your property, your call, but this is going to take some time. These big RVs aren't easy to maneuver. It took Pete almost an hour to get the RV properly hooked up and removed from my driveway. By then, it was almost 9 in the morning, and I had missed my first meeting. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered to watch, including Deborah, who stood at the edge of my property with her arms crossed and her face red with anger. "Vincent, you can't do this. That RV belongs to the Hendersons." "Then the Hendersons shouldn't have parked it on my property without permission," I called back, pulling out of my garage in my newly freed car. I saw her on her phone as I drove away, probably calling her precious board members to complain. I didn't care. I was done being pushed around by an HOA that thought it had unlimited power over everyone's lives. The police finally showed up at my house around 11 a.m. According to the doorbell camera notification I got on my phone. I was in the middle of a meeting, but I called them back on my lunch break. Officer Sandra Martinez was the responding officer, and she explained that she had taken a report and tried to speak to the HOA president. Mrs. Whitmore was quite insistent that the HOA had the legal right to assign your garage as temporary storage, Officer Martinez said. I explained to her that property rights don't work that way, but she kept citing their bylaws. "I've made a report for trespassing and unauthorized entry. Do you want to press charges?" "Absolutely." "Okay. I need you to come down to the station when you have time to give a full statement. Bring any documentation you have about your property ownership and any communications from the HOA." I promised I would and spent my lunch break calling the attorney I'd been referred to. Her name was Patricia Summers, and her office was in Scottsdale. I explained the entire situation, and she agreed to take my case. "This is egregious, Mr. Yates. HOAs have been getting increasingly aggressive about enforcing rules, but what they've done here crosses into criminal behavior. Breaking into your garage, allowing third parties to store items without your consent, that's illegal entry and conversion of property at minimum. Can we get them to remove all that stuff from my garage today? We can certainly try. I'll draft an emergency demand letter and have it couriered to the HOA president and board members this afternoon. We'll also send copies to the Hendersons. If they don't remove everything within 24 hours, we'll seek a restraining order and possibly file criminal complaints." I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. Finally, someone who understood how insane this situation was. When I got home from work that evening around 6 p.m., the stuff was still in my garage. I had half expected it to be gone, but apparently Deborah and her board were deciding to dig in their heels. There was, however, an angry note taped to my front door. "Mr. Yates, your actions today were selfish and contrary to the spirit of community living. The Henderson family is now facing storage fees because of your refusal to cooperate. You will be fined $500 for towing a vehicle from community-designated parking, and an additional $200 per day until you allow the Hendersons to retrieve their belongings from the storage space. You are also now in violation of the Good Neighbor policy and will be subject to additional sanctions. Please contact the HOA board immediately to discuss resolution. Deborah Whitmore, HOA President." I took a photo of the note and sent it to Patricia Summers along with a text. "They're threatening to fine me. This is escalating." She responded within minutes. "Don't pay anything. This is extortion. I'll have a cease and desist delivered first thing tomorrow morning." I went inside and made myself dinner, trying to calm down. My phone started ringing around 7 p.m. It was a number I didn't recognize with a Phoenix area code. "Hello, is this Vincent Yates?" The voice was male, angry, and loud. "Who's asking?" "This is Brian Henderson. You had my RV towed today and now I'm out $600 in towing and impound fees. You parked your RV on my property without permission and put your stuff in my garage without asking me. What did you expect? Deborah said you agreed to let us use your garage. She said she emailed you and you didn't object. I never got any email, and even if I had, not responding doesn't mean yes. You broke into my garage and took over my property. That's illegal. We didn't break in. Deborah gave us the access code for your garage door." My blood went cold. "What access code?" "The one that opens your garage. All the HOA presidents have them in case of emergencies. Deborah said it was fine that we were allowed to use your space because you weren't using it." I sat down hard on my couch. "Deborah has the code to my garage door. How?" "I don't know, man. She just said she had it. Look, I need you to tell the impound lot that this was a mistake so I can get my RV back without paying all these fees. No, what you and Deborah did was commit breaking and entering. I'm pressing charges against both of you. And I want your stuff out of my garage by tomorrow afternoon, or I'm calling the police and having it removed as abandoned property." "You can't do that. We have rights." "No, you don't. You have zero rights to my property. Get your stuff out or it's going to the dump." I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking again. I immediately went to my garage and looked at the keypad on the wall. The opener was programmable and did have multiple user codes available. When I'd moved in, I'd set my own code, but I'd never thought about whether the previous owner's codes were still active or if anyone else had access. I spent the next hour going through the settings and deleting every saved code except my own. Then I changed my personal code to something new. I also checked my home security system and discovered that it had logs showing my garage door had been opened at 10:40 p.m. the previous night using code 3, which was labeled HOA emergency access. I immediately forwarded all of this information to Patricia Summers and Officer Martinez. This wasn't just trespassing anymore. This was premeditated. Deborah had deliberately used emergency access codes for a non-emergency purpose and had given my property access to strangers. The next morning, Wednesday, I woke up to find 3 members of the HOA board standing in my driveway. Along with Deborah, there was Stephen Mitchell, the vice president, and Carol Brennan, the treasurer. They all looked extremely unhappy. I opened my front door but didn't step outside. "Can I help you?" Deborah stepped forward, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "Vincent, we need to resolve this situation. The Hendersons are very upset, and your actions yesterday have created a significant problem for the community." "My actions? You broke into my garage, Deborah. You used emergency access codes for something that wasn't an emergency. That's illegal." Stephen, a balding man in his 60s who always wore golf shirts, cleared his throat. "Now, Vincent, let's not be dramatic. The HOA has certain rights to access properties in specific circumstances. This was a community welfare situation." "No, it wasn't. You wanted to help your friends avoid paying for storage, so you decided to commandeer my private property without asking. That's not community welfare, that's theft." Carol, a thin woman with graying hair, jumped in. "We're prepared to waive the fines if you agree to allow the Hendersons to remove their belongings peacefully and to acknowledge that the HOA acted within its authority." "Absolutely not. I want all their stuff out of my garage by 5 p.m. today. If it's not gone, I'm having the police remove it. And I've hired an attorney. You'll be hearing from her." Deborah's face was turning that particular shade of red that suggested her blood pressure was through the roof. "You're making a huge mistake, Vincent. This community operates on cooperation and mutual respect. If you can't be a team player, maybe you shouldn't be living here." Is that a threat? It's a reality check. We have the power to make your life very difficult. And I have the power to sue you personally for harassment, trespassing, illegal entry, and conversion of property. Try me. I shut the door and locked it, then watched through the window as they stood there arguing among themselves for a few minutes before finally leaving. My heart was pounding. I'd never been someone who liked confrontation, but this situation had pushed me past my limit. Around noon, Patricia called me. "I've sent the cease and desist letters. I also did some digging into your HOA's bylaws and declaration of covenants. That clause they're citing about unused garage space. It doesn't exist. There's a clause about maintaining common areas and another about temporary parking of work vehicles, but nothing that gives them the right to appropriate individual garages for storage. So they made it up. Either that, or they're misinterpreting something completely. Either way, they have no legal leg to stand on. I've also sent a formal demand for them to provide copies of all garage access codes they have and to delete any access to your property immediately. If they don't comply, we can add that to the charges. What happens next? That depends on them. If they back down and remove everything, we can still pursue criminal charges for what they've already done. If they continue to push, we escalate. I've also prepared a civil suit for damages, harassment, and violation of property rights that we can file if needed." I thanked her and hung up, feeling slightly better. At least I had someone on my side who knew what they were doing. At 4:30 p.m., just as I was leaving work, I got a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Mr. Yates, this is Sandra Henderson, Brian's wife." The voice was female, tired, and much calmer than her husband's had been. "I want to apologize. We honestly thought we had permission to use your garage. Deborah told us you'd agreed to it and that it was all arranged through the HOA. Did you wonder why I wasn't contacted directly? She said you were often busy with work and preferred to handle things through the HOA. We're new to the neighborhood. We just moved in 3 months ago, and we didn't know any better. Our house flooded from a pipe burst, and we needed somewhere to store our things while repairs were done. Deborah offered your garage and said it was a community support program." I felt my anger deflate slightly. They'd been lied to as well. "Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate the apology, but you still should have questioned it. How would you feel if you came home and found strangers' belongings in your garage? You're right. I'm sorry. Can we please come get our things this evening? We've arranged for a storage unit." "Yes. I'll be home by 6. Please have everything out by 8 p.m. She agreed, and I hung up feeling a complex mix of emotions. The Hendersons were victims of Deborah's overreach too, in a way, but they still should have used common sense. I arrived home at 6:15 to find a moving truck in front of my house and Brian and Sandra Henderson already loading boxes. They were a couple in their 40s, and both looked exhausted. Brian wouldn't make eye contact with me, but Sandra approached as I got out of my car. "Thank you for letting us get our things," she said quietly. "We really are sorry. We're planning to file a complaint against Deborah with the board. What she did to you and to us by lying isn't right. I appreciate that. Just for future reference, if someone tells you that you can use someone else's property, always verify it with the property owner directly." She nodded, looking embarrassed, and went back to helping her husband load the truck. It took them until 7:45 to get everything out. I stood in my garage afterward, looking at the oil stains on the concrete where their motorcycle had been, and the scuff marks on the walls from where they'd stacked boxes. I was going to need to repaint. Thursday morning, I received a certified letter from the HOA. Inside was a formal notice that I was being fined $1,500 for disruption of community harmony, unauthorized towing of a community member's vehicle, and failure to cooperate with HOA directives. The letter stated that the fine must be paid within 30 days, or they would place a lien on my property. I scanned the letter and sent it to Patricia immediately. She called me back within an hour, and I could hear the anger in her voice. This is absolutely actionable. They're now engaging in retaliation and extortion. I'm filing for an emergency restraining order against the HOA board to prevent them from taking any further action against you, and I'm preparing criminal complaints. Do you want to move forward with this fully? Because if we do, it's going to get ugly. Yes, they need to understand they can't do this to people. Okay, I'll need you to sign some paperwork. Can you come to my office this afternoon? I took a long lunch and drove to Scottsdale. Patricia's office was in a professional building near Old Town, and she had papers ready for me to review and sign. We spent an hour going over everything. The timeline of events, all the evidence I'd collected, the costs I'd incurred for towing and legal fees, and the emotional distress this had caused. I'm also going to recommend that you file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, Patricia said. They oversee HOA regulations and can investigate misconduct. This kind of behavior needs to be on record. I signed everything and left feeling like I was finally fighting back properly. But I also felt drained. This was consuming so much of my time and energy, and I just wanted it to be over. That evening, I got a knock on my door around 7 p.m. I looked through the peephole and saw Officer Martinez along with another officer I didn't recognize. I opened the door. Officer Martinez, hi, Mr. Yates. We need to talk to you about pressing charges. Can we come in? I let them into my living room, and they both remained standing, which made me nervous. We've reviewed your case and the evidence you provided, Officer Martinez said. Based on what we've found, there are grounds for multiple charges against Mrs. Whitmore and potentially the Hendersons. Breaking and entering, trespassing, unauthorized use of property access codes, and possibly conversion. The county attorney's office has reviewed it, and they're willing to prosecute if you want to move forward. What would that involve? You'd need to give a formal statement, testify if it goes to trial, and be prepared for this to take some time. The Hendersons have indicated they'd be willing to testify against Mrs. Whitmore if charges are brought, since they now realize she lied to them about having your permission. Do it, I said, all of it. The other officer, whose name tag read Ramirez, pulled out a notebook. Okay, let's start from the beginning. Tell us everything that happened. I spent the next 2 hours going through every detail, every conversation, every piece of evidence. They took notes, recorded my statement, and collected copies of all my photos and videos. When they finally left, it was after 9 p.m. and I was emotionally exhausted. Friday morning, I woke up to my phone exploding with notifications. Apparently word had gotten out in the neighborhood about what was happening, and I had texts and missed calls from at least a dozen neighbors. Some were supportive, saying that Deborah had been overstepping for years, and it was about time someone stood up to her. Others were accusatory, calling me a troublemaker who was ruining the neighborhood harmony. One message stood out. It was from my neighbor Marcus. Dude, be careful. Deborah is telling everyone you're being investigated for harassment and that you attacked her verbally in front of witnesses. She's trying to turn the neighborhood against you. I forwarded the message to Patricia with a note. She's now defaming me to the neighbors. Patricia responded, document everything. Get written statements from friendly neighbors if possible. This supports our harassment and retaliation case. I spent my lunch break that day writing emails to the neighbors who had reached out in support, asking if they'd be willing to provide written statements about their own experiences with Deborah and the HOA board. 4 of them agreed immediately. The following Monday, everything exploded. Patricia filed the restraining order petition. The criminal complaints were formally filed with the county attorney, and I submitted my complaint to the Arizona Department of Real Estate. By Monday afternoon, Deborah had been served with multiple legal documents. She showed up at my house at 6 p.m. with her lawyer, a man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I didn't open the door, instead speaking to them through my Ring camera. "What do you want, Deborah?" Her lawyer stepped forward. "Mr. Yates, my name is Richard Klein. I represent Mrs. Whitmore and the Sunridge Springs HOA board. My clients would like to resolve this matter amicably. They're prepared to drop all fines against you and issue a formal apology if you'll agree to drop the criminal charges and the civil suit." "No, Mr. Yates, please be reasonable. This benefits no one. Legal proceedings will cost everyone time and money. Deborah broke into my property, lied to third parties to gain access to my garage, and then tried to extort me with fake fines when I objected. That's criminal behavior. She needs to face consequences." Deborah pushed forward, her face contorted with anger. "You self-righteous piece of work. I was trying to help a family in need. The Hendersons had nowhere to store their belongings and you had empty space. That's what communities do, they help each other. By stealing, by breaking and entering. You could have asked me, Deborah. You could have called, texted, knocked on my door, sent a letter. Instead, you broke into my garage in the middle of the night and handed over my property to strangers. I used proper HOA protocols. You used emergency access codes for a non-emergency situation. That's a crime." Her lawyer put a hand on her arm, trying to calm her down, but she shook him off. "Everyone in this neighborhood is going to know what kind of person you are, Vincent. You'll be ostracized. No one will want to live near you. Is that another threat?" "Because my attorney will love hearing about this." I held up my phone, showing that I was recording the conversation through the Ring app. The lawyer's face went pale. "Mrs. Whitmore, we need to leave. Now." He practically dragged her back to his car. I sent the recording to Patricia immediately with the subject line, "More threats and attempted intimidation." She called me 10 minutes later. "Vincent, this woman is her own worst enemy. She just handed us even more ammunition. The restraining order hearing is scheduled for Wednesday." With this new recording, I'm very confident we'll get it approved. Tuesday, I received a call from a detective named William Torres. He was investigating the breaking and entering charges and wanted to interview me formally. We set up a time for Wednesday morning before the restraining order hearing. The detective's interview was thorough. He went through every detail of what happened, examined all my evidence, and asked probing questions about my interactions with Deborah and the HOA board. He was professional, but I could tell he was taking this seriously. "Mr. Yates, I want you to understand that what happened to you is part of a larger pattern we're seeing with aggressive HOAs," Detective Torres said. "We've had 3 other complaints this year about Sunridge Springs specifically, all involving Mrs. Whitmore overstepping her authority. One involved her entering someone's backyard without permission to measure their shed. Another involved her demanding access to someone's home security footage without a warrant, and a third involved her attempting to fine someone for having the wrong color welcome mat. She's done this before. Multiple times. The difference is, you're the first person to push back hard enough to involve law enforcement and attorneys, Most people just pay the fines and move on because they don't want the hassle. That's what she's counting on. Exactly, which is why your case is important. If we can establish a pattern of behavior and get it on record, it protects future residents. The restraining order hearing that afternoon was surreal. It was held in a courtroom in downtown Phoenix, and both sides presented their cases to a judge. Patricia laid out everything that had happened, showed the evidence, and played the recording from Monday night. Deborah's attorney tried to argue that everything was a misunderstanding and that the HOA had acted in good faith. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judge Carolyn Reeves, listened to everything with an increasingly skeptical expression. When Deborah's attorney finished, Judge Reeves looked over her glasses at Deborah. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've reviewed the HOA bylaws and covenants that were submitted as evidence. I can find no provision that grants you or the board the authority to appropriate individual homeowners' private property for community use. Can you point me to the specific section you believe grants you this authority?" Deborah stood up, flustered. "Your Honor, it's a matter of community welfare. Section 12, Paragraph 8 discusses the efficient use of common resources. Garages are not common resources, Mrs. Whitmore. They're private property. Do you understand the difference?" Yes, but in the spirit of community support. Mrs. Whitmore, the law doesn't care about your interpretation of community spirit. You used emergency access codes to enter Mr. Yates' private property without his knowledge or consent for a non-emergency purpose. You then allowed third parties to store their belongings in his garage, again without his permission. When he objected and removed the unauthorized items and vehicle, you attempted to fine him and place a lien on his property. This is textbook harassment and abuse of authority. Judge Reeves granted the restraining order, prohibiting Deborah and the entire HOA board from contacting me directly, entering my property for any reason, or taking any punitive actions against me while the criminal and civil cases were pending. The judge also ordered the HOA to pay my legal fees for the restraining order hearing, which came to about $3,000. As we left the courtroom, I could see Deborah crying in the hallway while her attorney spoke to her in low, urgent tones. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Over the next few weeks, things moved faster than I expected. The Hendersons did file formal complaints against Deborah with the HOA board, and several other homeowners came forward with their own stories of her overreach. There was a special board meeting where angry residents demanded answers about why Deborah had been allowed to operate with so much unchecked power. Marcus called me after that meeting. "Dude, you should have been there. It was like a lynch mob. People were furious." Apparently Deborah has been pulling stunts like this for years, just smaller stuff that people didn't think was worth fighting. But your case opened the floodgates. The board voted to remove her as president, and they're talking about completely restructuring the HOA leadership. What about the other board members who backed her up? Stephen Mitchell resigned. Carol Brennan is staying on, but she's basically thrown Deborah under the bus, saying she didn't know the full extent of what Deborah was doing. Classic political move. I felt a grim satisfaction. The system was working, slowly but surely. The criminal case moved to the county attorney's office, and I was told that Deborah was being charged with criminal trespassing, unauthorized use of access devices, and harassment. The Hendersons were not being charged after they agreed to testify against Deborah and provided evidence that she had explicitly told them she had my permission. In early April, about 6 weeks after the initial incident, I got a call from Patricia. "Vincent, Deborah's attorney has reached out. She wants to settle. She's willing to plead guilty to reduce charges. Agree to never hold any HOA position again, pay full restitution for all your legal fees and damages, and issue a formal public apology to you and the community. What would the reduced charges be? Misdemeanor trespassing and a fine. No jail time, but it would be on her record. I thought about it for a long moment. Part of me wanted to see her face the full consequences in a trial, but another part of me was exhausted and just wanted this to be over. What do you recommend? I think the settlement is fair. You get full restitution, she faces criminal consequences and public accountability, and you can move on with your life. A trial would take months, maybe years if she appeals, and there's always a risk, however small, that something unexpected happens. Okay. Let's settle. The settlement was finalized 2 weeks later. Deborah pleaded guilty to misdemeanor criminal trespassing in a brief court hearing that I attended. She had to stand before Judge Reeves and admit what she had done. The judge was not gentle. Mrs. Whitmore, you abused a position of trust and authority. You violated the sanctity of someone's home for your own misguided sense of what community means. You're fortunate that Mr. Yates is willing to accept this settlement because, frankly, you deserve harsher consequences. I'm sentencing you to 100 hours of community service, 18 months probation, and a fine of $5,000. You are also barred from serving on any homeowners association board in the state of Arizona for 10 years. You understand? Yes, Your Honor, Deborah said quietly, her voice barely audible. The restitution came to just over $18,000, covering all my legal fees, the towing costs, the money I'd lost taking time off work, and damages for emotional distress and the cost of repainting my garage. Deborah's attorney wrote a check that day. The public apology was published in the Sunridge Springs community newsletter and posted on the HOA website. It was thorough and humiliating, acknowledging everything she had done wrong and apologizing to me specifically and to the community in general for her abuse of power. A few days after the settlement was finalized, I received a handwritten letter in my mailbox. It was from Deborah. Mr. Yates, I know my official apology probably means little to you, but I wanted to write to you personally. I was wrong. I let my desire to help the Hendersons override common sense and basic respect for your rights. I told myself I was acting for the good of the community, but really I was just drunk on the small amount of power I had. I've lost my position, my reputation, and nearly lost my marriage over this. My husband is furious with me and my adult children aren't speaking to me. I deserve all of it. I hope someday you can forgive me, but I understand if you can't. I'm truly sorry. Deborah Whitmore. I read the letter twice, then filed it away with all the other documents from the case. I didn't respond. Some things don't need a response. Life slowly returned to normal. The HOA elected new leadership, people who were much more reasonable and focused on actual community improvement rather than power trips. They reached out to me, apologized on behalf of the organization, and asked if I had any suggestions for improving HOA governance. I gave them an earful about transparency, accountability, and the need for clear checks on board authority. They actually listened and implemented several changes, including requiring board approval for any use of emergency access codes, prohibiting the board from entering private property without explicit written permission, except in genuine emergencies, and establishing an independent ombudsman position to hear complaints about board actions. Marcus and several other neighbors took me out for dinner one night to celebrate what they called the liberation of Sunridge Springs. "You did what we all wanted to do but were too scared to try," said my neighbor Jennifer, who lived 3 houses down. Deborah made all our lives miserable with her petty rules and power plays. You stood up to her and won. I just wanted my garage back, I said, but I was smiling. The Hendersons moved out of the neighborhood about 2 months after everything settled. Brian sent me a text before they left. We're moving closer to Sandra's family, but I wanted to thank you for handling everything the way you did. We learned a hard lesson about questioning authority and not taking people at their word. Best wishes. I wished them well in return. They'd made a mistake, but they'd owned it and made amends. That was more than Deborah had done until she was forced to. By summer, the whole incident felt like a strange dream. I'd go out to my garage, which I'd repainted a nice clean white, and think about how it had been full of someone else's belongings. How I'd woken up one morning to find my life invaded by someone who thought her position gave her unlimited authority. Patricia called me in July with some interesting news. Vincent, I wanted you to know that the Arizona Department of Real Estate completed their investigation into Sunridge Springs HOA. They found multiple violations of state HOA regulations and have imposed significant fines on the organization. They've also mandated training for all current and future board members on property rights and the limits of HOA authority. That's good to hear. There's more. Your case has become something of a landmark. Several other attorneys have reached out to me asking for details because they have clients in similar situations. You standing up to your HOA has created precedent that's helping other homeowners fight back against overreach. I hadn't expected that. I just wanted to protect my property and make sure Deborah faced consequences. The idea that it was helping other people felt good. In August, I got a new neighbor. A young couple named David and Amy bought the house next to mine that had been on the market for months. I introduced myself while they were moving in, and Amy immediately said, "Oh, you're Vincent. We heard about what happened with the HOA president. That was actually one of the reasons we felt comfortable buying here. We knew the HOA had cleaned house and was operating better now." It was strange to think that my nightmare had actually made the neighborhood more attractive to some people. But I supposed it showed that new leadership was serious about doing things right. The new HOA president was a retired school teacher named George Franklin, who ran the board like a democracy rather than a dictatorship. He was fair, transparent, and actually responsive to homeowner concerns. It was like night and day compared to Deborah's reign. I ran into Deborah once in late September at a grocery store in Phoenix. We saw each other across the produce section and both froze. For a moment, I thought she might try to talk to me, but instead she quickly turned her cart around and went down a different aisle. I felt a pang of something, maybe pity, but I also felt relief. We had nothing to say to each other. As fall arrived and the Phoenix heat finally broke, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. What started as an ordinary Tuesday morning heading to work had turned into a months-long legal battle that fundamentally changed my community and taught me things about property rights, HOA law, and personal boundaries that I never expected to learn. I'd spent about $20,000 on legal fees, though I'd been reimbursed for most of it. I'd spent countless hours dealing with lawyers, police, courts, and paperwork. I'd been stressed, angry, and anxious for weeks, but I'd also stood up for myself in a way I never had before. I'd refused to be pushed around by someone who thought their authority was unlimited. And I'd won. More importantly, I'd helped create change that protected other homeowners from experiencing what I'd gone through. The new HOA policies, the state investigation, the precedent my case had set, all of it meant that Deborah's reign of petty tyranny was over, and future boards would think twice before overstepping their bounds. On a Friday evening in October, I sat in my garage with the door open, enjoying the cool evening air. My car was parked in its proper spot, my tools were on my workbench, and everything was exactly as it should be. My property, my space, my rules. Marcus walked by with his dog and stopped to chat. "You doing okay, man? I know this whole year has been crazy for you." "I'm good," I said, and I meant it. "It was rough, but it needed to happen." "Well, I'm glad you were the one to do it. Most of us didn't have the guts. Hey, there's a neighborhood barbecue next weekend. You should come. George is organizing it as a way to bring everyone together under the new board." "I'll be there," I promised. After Marcus left, I sat in the quiet evening, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood. Kids playing down the street, someone's television through an open window, the distant hum of traffic on the main road. Normal sounds of normal life. What had happened to me was outrageous and shouldn't happen to anyone. But it had happened, and I dealt with it the right way. I documented everything, sought proper legal counsel, involved law enforcement when appropriate, and pursued justice through the correct channels. I hadn't gotten violent, I hadn't retaliated illegally, and I hadn't let fear or intimidation make me back down. The system had worked. Slowly, expensively, and stressfully, but it had worked. Deborah had faced criminal consequences, financial penalties, and public accountability. The HOA had been restructured and reformed. Other homeowners were now protected by better policies and increased oversight. As the sun set and the desert sky turned brilliant shades of orange and purple, I closed my garage door with my own code, knowing that no one else had access to my property anymore. I walked into my house, locked the door behind me, and felt genuinely at peace for the first time in months. The battle with my HOA was over, and I had won. But more than that, I'd learned that standing up for your rights, even when it's difficult and costly, is always worth it. Because allowing authority to go unchecked, whether it's a government, a corporation, or just a power-hungry HOA president, is how good people lose their freedoms one small violation at a time. I'd drawn my line in the sand the morning I found an RV blocking my driveway and someone else's belongings in my garage, and I defended that line all the way to the courthouse. My home was mine again, truly and completely, and no one was ever going to take that from me without facing serious consequences. The next morning, I woke up and went through my normal routine. Coffee, shower, breakfast, check my email. There was a message from the new HOA board with the agenda for the next community meeting. It covered normal things like landscape maintenance proposals, budget discussions for the next fiscal year, and a vote on updating the playground equipment in the common area. Boring, reasonable HOA business. Exactly as it should be. I marked my calendar to attend the meeting, something I'd never done before the incident with Deborah. But I'd learned that staying informed and involved was the best way to ensure the HOA never again became a tool for someone's power trips. Several other neighbors who'd been inspired by my case had also started attending meetings regularly, forming a sort of unofficial watchdog group to keep the board accountable. Later that week, I received a thank you card from the family who had moved into the house 2 streets over. They'd apparently had an issue where the HOA asked to inspect their backyard for covenant compliance. But instead of demanding entry, the new board had scheduled an appointment at a time convenient for the homeowners and had given them a written checklist of what would be inspected. "This is how HOAs should operate," the note said. "Thank you for making it happen." Patricia Summers called me in early November with final news about the case. "Vincent, I wanted to let you know that the Arizona Department of Real Estate has published their findings and recommendations." Your case is cited as an example of HOA board misconduct. It's being used in training materials now for HOA management companies across the state. Really? Really? What happened to you is now part of the official record of what HOAs cannot do. That's a pretty significant legacy. After we hung up, I looked up the Department of Real Estate report online. There it was, pages of analysis about the limits of HOA authority, the importance of respecting property rights, and the criminal consequences of overreach. Case study number 3 was my situation, with names redacted but details intact. I printed out a copy and filed it with all my other documents from the case. Someday, maybe years from now, I'd look back at this folder and remember the time I'd had to fight for my own home. But I'd also remember that I'd won, and that winning had meant something beyond just my personal situation. December brought the holidays and a dramatic shift in community dynamics. The HOA organized a holiday party, something Deborah had never done because she'd always said it was outside the scope of HOA responsibilities. George Franklin, the new president, had a different philosophy. "We're not just an enforcement body," he said at the party. "We're actually supposed to build community." I attended the party and found myself chatting with neighbors I'd barely known before. Several of them thanked me quietly for standing up to Deborah. One older woman named Margaret pulled me aside and told me her story. 3 years ago, Deborah tried to find me because my rose bushes were growing through the fence into the common area. She wanted me to cut them back to nothing. When I said that would kill the plants, she threatened to have them removed herself and charge me for it. I ended up cutting them back and they never recovered. I was so angry, but I didn't know what to do. Margaret's eyes were wet with tears. "You did what I wish I'd had the courage to do. Thank you." I hugged her, this woman I barely knew, and felt the weight of what had happened shift slightly. It wasn't just about my garage or my property rights. It was about a community that had been living under fear of petty authority, and one person standing up had freed all of them. As the year came to a close, I found myself in a strange position. I was known in the neighborhood now, not as just another resident, but as the guy who'd taken on the HOA and won. People asked my advice about dealing with board issues. New homeowners reached out to introduce themselves. I'd even been asked to join the board, though I'd politely declined. I had no desire for that kind of responsibility. On New Year's Eve, I stood in my driveway at midnight, watching fireworks explode over Phoenix in the distance. My garage door was closed, my property was secure, and my community was healthier than it had been in years. The year that had started with such violation and chaos was ending with peace and resolution. I thought about Deborah sometimes, wondering how she was doing. I'd heard through the neighborhood gossip that she and her husband had moved to Tucson for a fresh start. I hoped she'd learned from what happened, but I also knew that wasn't my responsibility. I'd done what I needed to do to protect myself and establish boundaries. What she did with that lesson was up to her. The legal case was closed, the criminal penalties had been served, and the restitution had been paid. The restraining order had expired after 6 months with no violations. The civil suit had been settled. Every loose end had been tied up. It was truly, finally over. As I went back inside my house that night, I paused in the doorway and looked back at my property one more time. My lawn, my driveway, my garage, my home. All of it mine, protected by law and precedent, secured by boundaries that had been tested and held firm. I'd never asked for any of this. I just wanted to go to work that Tuesday morning back in March. But sometimes life forces you to fight for things you thought were guaranteed. And when that happens, the only choice is to stand your ground or lose something precious. I'd stood my ground, and in doing so, I'd protected not just myself but everyone else in my community. That was worth every dollar spent, every hour of stress, every moment of confrontation. Because homes are supposed to be safe spaces, sanctuaries where authority ends at your property line. And when someone crosses that line without permission, they need to face consequences serious enough that they never do it again. As I locked my door that New Year's Eve and turned off the lights, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: complete security in my own home. No one had secret access codes anymore. No one thought they could use my property without asking. No one believed the HOA had unlimited power over individual homeowners. The battle was over, and the right side had won. Justice had been served, reforms had been implemented, and a community had been freed from tyranny, even if it was just the petty tyranny of an overreaching HOA president. In the grand scheme of things, my case might seem small, but to the people living in Sunridge Springs, it had been revolutionary. I went to sleep that night knowing that my property was mine alone, and that was exactly how it should be. The nightmare that had started with an RV in my driveway and strangers' belongings in my garage had ended with justice, accountability, and lasting change. And if that wasn't a happy ending, I didn't know what was.